好高興喺呢度見到大家，讓我哋一齊起立。好感謝上帝俾到我哋有生命氣息，一齊去敬拜呢位三位一體嘅真神。包括直播嘅弟兄姊妹，希望大家都一齊起立。我哋以詩歌音樂開始今日嘅主日崇拜。
歷世萬邦，誰可與你相比？尊貴的你，縱是神但卻謙卑，願降生來體恤我憂困。你是耶穌，至善至美。
歷世萬邦，誰可與你相比？尊貴的你，縱是神但卻謙卑，願降生來體恤我憂困。你是耶穌，至善至美。耶穌本有上帝嘅形象，卻唔肯堅持自己與神平等嘅地位，取了僕人嘅形象，成為人嘅樣式。讓我哋一齊敬拜呢位道成肉身嘅主耶穌。歷世萬邦，誰可與你相比？
歷世萬邦，誰可與你相比？尊貴的你，縱是神但卻謙卑，願降生來體恤我憂困。你是耶穌，至善 主向你。洪水即將泛濫之時，是我主坐着為王，願天歡喜，願地上快樂，如鷹展翅上騰，等候我主的必不羞愧，是你甘霖雨露滋潤一切。
洪水即將泛濫之時，是我主坐着為王，願天歡喜，願地快樂，投靠你。
投靠你翅膀蔭下，在你光中不必驚怕，唯獨敬畏你的方可得依靠，別再自意來主向你。洪水即將泛濫之時，是我主坐着為王，願天歡喜，願地上快樂，如鷹展翅上騰，等候我主的必不羞愧，是你甘霖雨露滋潤一切。洪水即將泛濫之時，是我主坐着為王，願天歡喜，願地上快樂，如鷹展翅上騰，等候我主的必不羞愧，是你甘霖雨露滋潤一切。天父，你名是多麼美，榮耀遍全地，在禱告良辰，靜觀你的美。 恬靜我沉默主座前，無用多片言，在禱告前，你已清楚我需要。求賜我傷心的眼睛，風暴裏仍舊恬靜，全獻我信服的心靈，由你
齊敬拜嘅時候，亦都將我哋嘅音樂好似禱告一樣，全權交喺主嘅手上。藉着主耶穌，我哋可以去禱告，我哋有呢份嘅權柄。你嘅名多麼美，
天父，你名是多麼美，榮耀遍全地，在禱告良神，承歡你的美。天際，我曾默主座前，無用多片言，在禱告前，你已清楚我需要。求賜我信心的眼睛，風暴裏仍舊天跡，全獻我信服的生命，由你全權來帶領。願人都尊你名為聖，願你的國降臨，也願你旨意行在地上，如同行在天上。我們當天所需要的食物，求你賜給我們，免我們的債，如同我們免去人的債。不要我們遇見試探，救我們脫離兇惡，因國度權柄榮耀全屬你，直到永遠。願人都尊你名為聖，願你的國降臨，也願你旨意行在地上，如同行在天上。我們當天所需要的食物，求你賜給我們，免我們的債，如同我們免去人的債。我們在天上的父，願人都尊你名為聖。
讓我哋一齊禱告。慈悲信實嘅天父，感謝你創造天地，感謝主耶穌，你道成肉身，為我哋同神中間作咗中保。感謝聖靈住喺我哋心裏邊，願一切嘅榮耀頌讚都歸給你。奉靠主耶穌基督聖名祈求，阿門。大家請坐。
感謝我哋嘅神，就正如頭先好美好嘅詩歌，我哋咧尊我哋嘅神嘅名為聖，因為咧佢係我哋至聖嘅主。我哋亦都咧係我哋嘅禱告咧，係因為我哋帶住盼望，我哋知道咧神咧係明白、係知道、係掌管呢個世界萬物，包括我哋嘅生命，所有嘅一切。咁咧我哋有唔同嘅事情去祈禱，我哋一齊繼續低頭嚟到去禱告。親愛嘅天父上帝，我哋感謝你，就正如我哋一路所唱嘅詩歌，提醒我哋有禱告嘅權柄，讓我哋可以隨時隨在嘅得到你嘅帶領同埋幫助。為到烏克蘭同埋俄羅斯之間嘅戰爭，主啊，我哋繼續禱告，背後可能係東方同埋西方多國之間嘅利害關係同埋一啲嘅衝突。主啊，我求你去憐憫正係受戰禍所影響嘅平民百姓，讓戰事能夠盡快嘅緩和。我哋感謝你一路嘅保守我哋喺灑水系統工程嘅施工，仲有就係我哋樂基堂嗰個裝修嘅工程。主啊，我哋盼望呢啲嘅工程完成咗之後，我哋可以更好嘅運用你賜俾我哋嘅堂址，去更好嘅服侍你，更好嘅去為你作見證。我哋亦都好感恩，我哋好開心，因為喺近日我哋有唔同嘅新朋友，我哋嘅新面孔嚟自唔同嘅地方，可以有機會參與我哋嘅崇拜同埋唔同嘅小組。 主啊，我哋求你去幫助佢哋能夠享受同埋投入彼此嘅認識，同埋能夠經歷到上帝你嘅帶領同埋真實。主啊，我哋亦都為着準備受浸嘅弟兄姊妹去禱告，使佢哋咧都可以喺特別而家佢哋參加緊嘅浸禮班嘅裏邊咧，有足夠嘅了解同埋身心靈嘅準備，去迎接同埋參與5月15號嗰個浸禮。主啊，我哋亦都為着 Chelsea 嘅姐夫 Alan， 我哋繼續嘅禱告。我哋雖然知道佢未能夠去甦醒，但係醫生家屬都證實咗佢係真係有微弱嘅意識嘅，佢係有反應，佢係聽到嘢嘅。主啊，我求你憐恤看顧佢而家嗰個身體嘅情況同埋嗰個病情嘅進展。主啊，我哋亦都去為着 Monita 嘅弟弟劉家明。主啊，我哋亦都知道佢近日咧確診咗左聲帶癌。主啊，我哋亦都知道佢咧亦都喺4月19號嘅時候就會做手術。神啊，我求你帶領同埋醫治，並且讓佢喺過程嘅裏邊經歷到上帝藉住主耶穌你所賜俾佢嘅力量同埋平安。主啊，我哋感恩，我哋知道咧並唔係我哋去禱告去提醒你，而係我哋可以喺禱告嘅裏邊經歷神你嘅大能，參與神你嘅工作，同埋係經歷到神你自己無論係對我哋或者係對我哋所代禱嘅人嗰份嘅祝福。主啊，我哋嘅禱告係奉耶穌基督嘅名，阿門。今日咧，我哋去一齊所睇嘅聖經係記載喺哥林多後書第4章第1節至到第18節。哥林多後書第4章第1節至到第18節。我們既然蒙憐憫，受了這職分，就不喪膽，乃將那些暗昧可恥的事棄絕了，不行詭詐，不謬講神的道理，只將真理表明出來，好在神面前把自己薦於各人的良心。如果我們的福音蒙蔽，就是蒙蔽在滅亡的人身上。此等不信之人被這世界的神弄瞎了心眼，不叫基督榮耀福音的光照着他們。基督本是神的像，我們原不是傳自己，乃是傳基督耶穌為主，並且自己因耶穌做你們的僕人。那吩咐光從黑暗裏照出來的神，已經照在我們心裏，叫我們得知神榮耀的光顯在基督耶穌的面上。我們有這寶貝放在瓦器裏，要顯明這莫大的能力是出於神，不是出於我們。我們四面受敵，卻不被困住；心裏作難，卻不致失望；遭逼迫，卻不被丟棄；打倒了，卻不致死亡。身上常帶着耶穌的死，使耶穌的生也顯明在我們身上。因為我們這活着的人，時常為耶穌被交於死地，使耶穌的生在我們這必死的身上顯明出來。這樣看來，死是在我們身上發動，生卻在你們身上發動。但我們既有信心，正如經上記着說：我因信，所以如此說話。我們也信，所以也說話。自己知道那叫耶穌復活的，也必叫我們與耶穌一同復活，並且叫我們與你們一同站在他面前。凡事都是為你們，好叫恩惠因人多越發加增，感謝格外顯多，以致榮耀歸於神。所以我們不喪膽，外體雖然毀壞，內心卻一天新似一天。我們這至暫至輕的苦楚，為要我們成就極重無比永遠的榮耀。原來我們不是顧念所看見的，乃是顧念所不見的，因為所看見的是暫時的，所不見的是永遠的。咁今天早上呢，我哋有簡廸明牧師呢去為我哋證道，佢嘅主題係縱有虧缺，聽從呼召。咁我哋有何耀基醫生呢嚟到同我哋做即時嘅傳譯。
Good morning, everybody.
各位早晨。
It is a real privilege for us, whether we are gathering here personally or whether we're here online, to have the actual opportunity to come and worship our God in such a free way as we can.
係我哋嘅福分，不論今日你哋係親身喺現場，或者喺屋企上網睇呢個崇拜，我哋一齊可以分享神嘅話語。
And to recognise that it is God who invites us and we respond to his call to gather together.
我哋知道係神呼召我哋就作出一個反應，一齊嚟聽呢個道。
I wanted to take the opportunity this morning to speak on something that's particularly close to my own heart.
今日呢個早上，我想藉助呢個機會同大家講一啲喺我心裏邊一個好重要嘅課題。
And it's about God's call to serve.
係關於神嘅呼召，我哋去侍奉。
And while I believe that God calls and gifts all his people to serve, whether it be out in the marketplace or in so-called vocational ministry, each of us is called to live a life that is worthy of our calling.
我絕對相信神係呼召我哋，同埋俾我哋所有人有足夠嘅恩賜，不論我哋係喺市集上邊或者係職場上邊，使到我哋每一個人係活出我哋生命。
There are those that God calls into specialised ministries, including those of pastoral responsibility.
固然當中有一啲係神呼召我哋做一啲好特別嘅事工，好似教牧嘅責任。
However, no matter who we are, God calls every one of us to minister in his name.
不過無論我哋係邊個，神係呼召我哋每一個人係藉着佢個名盡力去侍奉。
Therefore, I believe it is essential that for each of us, in light of our gifts and our abilities and our distinctive personalities, to serve God in whatever capacity we sense his call.
所以我相信對我哋嚟講，每一個人係好重要嘅。當我哋感受到呢個呼召嘅時候，我哋就利用我哋嘅恩賜、我哋嘅態度同埋我哋特有嘅性格，盡力去做。
And then to align this with how God's wider faith community also recognise and acknowledge that call in our lives.
同樣喺呢一個信仰嘅團體一樣，我哋亦都要認識同埋確認呢一個嘅呼召。
And I've chosen this particular passage today because I think it both encourages but also challenges us about some specific realities in relation to responding to God's call on our lives.
今日我揀咗呢段經文，就係因為我覺得呢段經文喺我哋回應神去對我哋嘅呼召，活出我哋嘅生命嘅時候，我哋喺當中係遇到好多困難。呢段經文就俾咗我哋好多鼓勵同埋支持。
The context of this letter is at a time when there had been strained relationships between Paul and the Corinthians, and some had been making accusations against him.
呢封書信嘅內容，當其時保羅同哥林多教會嘅會眾係有一個好唔好嘅關係，因為有啲人想控告佢添。
But Paul deeply wants to reconcile with these group of Christians.
不過保羅自己本身就想盡力咁挽回同呢一班弟兄嘅關係。
So he reminds them and us of some important truths of when we respond to God's call in our lives.
保羅就藉著呢封信去點明俾佢哋所有教徒聽，同埋俾我哋知道，當我哋接受神嘅呼召去活出我哋嘅生命嘅時候，當中我哋遇到嘅問題。
And firstly, in verse 6, that being called to serve is a privilege.
我哋喺第6節睇到第一個點就係被呼召服侍係我哋嘅特權。
In this chapter, Paul turns his particular attention to Christian service, a ministry of the new covenant that's been entrusted to all of us.
喺呢個第4章嘅經文裏邊，保羅將佢嘅注意力擺喺基督徒嘅侍奉，一個喺新約時代我哋係被委以重任嘅大使命。
You know, in 1 Corinthians 1 and verses 26 to 31, Paul had already reflected upon his own call to ministry, and he encouraged his hearers to do likewise.
喺哥林多前書1章26至31節，保羅其實就已經講咗佢自己對呢啲召命嘅呼召嘅反應，亦都鼓勵所有讀完呢篇經文嘅人，同樣好似佢咁做同一樣嘅事。
And here in verse 6, he says that we have this treasure, the light of the knowledge of the glory of God.
喺第6節嗰度講，我哋有呢一個寶藏，呢個就係神榮耀的光。
And God, through his great mercy, has given us an enormous privilege and responsibility to proclaim his gospel to all.
神喺佢嘅憐憫之下，俾咗我哋每一個人有極大嘅權力同埋責任，去將呢個福音講傳。
To preach Christ in both word and deed.
去傳開耶穌基督嘅信息，藉着我哋嘅口同埋我哋嘅行為。
You know, I know of no greater calling in one's life than to preach or to share Christ in all of one's life, and to take whatever opportunity I can to do so.
我絕對知道喺一生人裏邊最大嘅呼召就係宣揚基督，而我亦都係盡量爭取每一個咁嘅機會。
And while this includes those who are part of God's kingdom and what it means to be a God's community of faith,
呢個固然包括我哋喺神嘅天國裏邊，或者係呢一個信仰嘅群體裏邊。
it also includes those outside of the kingdom from whom the gospel is sometimes veiled.
但係亦都包括喺神嘅天國之外嗰啲，佢哋對於福音係被蒙蔽。
Over the years, I'm really thankful for the opportunities that I've had to engage with men and women of all ages and to share with them of the unconditional love that God has for them.
喺過去咁多年間，其實我自己覺得非常之開心，有咁多唔同嘅機會俾我可以同男嘅、女嘅、不同年紀嘅人去分享神無條件嘅愛。
I mean, even last Sunday morning, as I was outside of the street greeting people as you arrived, I was able to engage in a conversation with a man who was passing by, who thought he was so bad that he couldn't enter the church because God couldn't love a man like him.
就好似上個禮拜日朝頭早咁，我如常咁喺教會門口同啲人打招呼，我就有機會同其中一個路過嘅男人傾偈。佢自己覺得佢係一個好壞嘅人，佢唔值得入嚟教會，亦都唔值得接受神嘅愛。
Share with him that there's nobody in the church that's worse than him. Sorry, let me that there's no one in the church that is better than him.
佢自己覺得冇人喺個教會裏邊比佢更差。
That God loves all of us.
但係神係愛所有嘅人。
The greatest joy of my heart is whenever I see a person come to faith in Jesus and when people's lives are being transformed.
喺我心裏邊，當我見到一個人係信奉咗耶穌，亦都見到佢哋生命有更新嘅時候，呢個係最大嘅喜樂。
And then secondly, Paul recognizes that God delights in calling ordinary people there in verses 7 to 12.
第二點嘅就係保羅明白到神樂於呼召普通嘅人。
But he himself is aware of his own human frailties.
保羅自己絕對明白作為一個人，我哋嘅虧缺。
He knows that there are things in his background, in his life, that could undermine his testimony about the gospel. Some of his attitudes and values and thoughts and behaviours from his past.
佢絕對明白喺佢過去嘅背景或者佢過去嘅生命裏邊，有好多嘢係破壞咗佢對福音嘅見證。呢個包括咗佢嘅態度、佢嘅價值觀、佢嘅諗法同埋佢嘅行為。
You see, preaching is not about the words that one might just say from a pulpit, but it is the kind of lives that we live.
大家要明白，講道唔係就咁企喺講台上嗰把口講啲乜嘢，而係關於我哋嘅生命點樣活出來。
It is our life that preaches, therefore every one of us are preachers.
係我哋嘅生命係傳揚呢個福音，所以我哋每一個人都係喺度講緊道。
It's a lot about character.
絕對係關於我哋嘅性格。
You see, Paul is concerned about us being men and women of integrity, that the things we profess are accompanied by appropriate actions.
保羅好關注我哋呢一班正直嘅嘅人士，我哋口所講嘅一定要係同我哋相對嘅行動係相配。
That our lives in secret match our words in public.
我哋喺公眾場合講嘅嘢，要喺同我哋私下嘅生命係相稱。
That we're not deceptive, that we don't distort the truth.
我哋唔係做一啲欺騙嘅嘢，亦都唔係扭曲咗一個真相。
As we profess that we have received God's salvation, then we need to act like we've received it.
如果我哋口話我哋接受咗神嘅救恩，我哋做出嚟就係要係做出一樣嘅事。
We should have nothing that we're ashamed of.
對於我哋自己任何一樣嘢，我哋唔需要感覺到羞愧。
There shouldn't be any ongoing deceitfulness or dishonesty.
亦都唔需要做出任何嘢係有詭詐或者係不誠實嘅。
No lack of integrity.
我哋一定要有好正直嘅反應。
Nothing underhanded.
絕對唔需要用橫手。
Nothing that would have to be hushed up if it came out.
如果有啲咩事發生，亦都唔需要好快冚過佢。
However, Paul reminds us in verse 7 that we have this treasure in clay jars.
保羅喺第7節嗰度提醒咗我哋，佢話：我們有這寶貝放在瓦器裏。
We are earthen vessels, vulnerable vessels, which can be chipped or even broken.
我哋係瓦器，一個好易被打壞嘅容器，可能係崩咗，甚至係爛咗。
There are all kinds of jars here this morning, both online and here in this building, that all shapes and sizes, all different levels of maturity.
今日喺呢度嘅現場或者係喺屋企嘅，有唔同形類嘅瓦器，唔同形狀、唔同大細、唔同程度嘅成熟。
Some of us are new and young and still green, having not yet gone through the kiln, still moldable.
當中可能係好新、好年青、好幼稚，未經過個窯爐，所以仲係可以被塑造。
Others of us are fine, delicate, beautiful pieces of china, carefully hand-painted and very, very delicate.
或者當中有一啲係好精緻、好美麗，係一個好特別嘅瓦器，上邊係用手好小心咁去畫，畫得非常之精緻。
Others are a little bit rougher, a little more harsh, a little more rugged.
或者有啲係比較粗糙、凹凸不平。
And few of us are cracked, and we're broken, and we bear the marks of a tough and challenging life experiences.
或者我哋有啲係崩咗，甚至係爛咗，就正正代表咗喺我哋過去生命裏邊好多艱難同埋嘅挑戰所引致嘅印記。
Yet all of us, no matter what our earthen clay pot may look like, we have as believers the richness and the power of Jesus Christ.
但係所有我哋喺呢度嘅人，無論你個瓦器係點嘅樣，作為耶穌基督嘅跟從者，你就充滿咗佢嘅豐富同埋能力。
And it's to be poured within and it's to be overflowing.
佢係充滿咗我哋嘅瓦器，然後溢出來。
It's to be flowed out and not contained.
係需要倒出嚟，而唔係裝住喺裏邊。
I admit there have been times in my own ministry journey where I know that my life hasn't always stood the test.
我絕對承認喺我侍奉嘅歷程裏邊，不其時我嘅生命都係唔配，我係知道嘅。
And there have been numerous times when I felt quite inadequate and quite ill-equipped for the ministry for which I believe I've been called.
好多時雖然我係被呼召去做一啲嘢，但係我絕對知道我係欠缺同埋缺乏去準備。
I'm limited and fragile, particularly in new and unfamiliar surroundings.
特別係喺一啲新嘅或者一啲唔熟悉嘅環境，我就發覺我係好虧缺同埋好軟弱。
Yet it is through God's mercy that they are often the times God uses me the most and brings about his purposes.
但係正正就係呢啲時刻，神嘅恩典就係用到我，將到佢要成就嘅事係做到最好。
And I'm sure I'm not alone in all of this.
我絕對相信我唔係淨係我係咁樣。
Too often I hear people say, look, I'm so ordinary, I'm so average or undistinguished, I can't do anything significant.
好多時我都聽見人講，我好平凡嘅咋，好普通嘅咋，完全唔突出嘅，你唔好俾一啲咁麻煩嘅嘢我做。
But our ordinariness is not a liability. It's actually an asset if you really want God to be glorified.
但係其實我哋嘅平凡唔係一個負累，反之係一個資產。如果你真係想神喺當中值得榮耀嘅話
No one is too common, too weak, too shy, too inarticulate, too disabled to do what God really wants you to do with your gifts.
如果神係想利用你，俾足夠你有足夠嘅幫助嘅話，冇一個人係太平凡、太軟弱、太怕醜、太唔識講嘢，又或者係太缺乏。
You see, God's concept of service is so different from the world's concept.
神對於侍奉嘅概念同世界嘅概念好唔同。
The world stresses the classy container, not the glory of God in human weakness.
世界專注嘅係一個好優美嘅容器，但係神就係藉着我哋嘅軟弱就可以顯現到佢嘅榮耀。
On the other hand, we too need to be sure that we don't have a worldly view of ourselves.
所以當我哋批評自己嘅時候，就唔好採取呢一個世界觀。
That is a more elevated view that we are so worthy, so gifted, so precious, so polished, so independent that we don't need or even have room for the glory of God to be revealed.
因為如果我哋咁睇嘅時候，我哋就會自己覺得好有價值、好高級、好有恩賜、好有非常之特別，亦都係非常之完美，完全係自主，無需以下任何人嘅時候，你就會冇需要，亦都冇地方容許神嘅榮耀喺當中顯現出嚟。
And one of my heartaches over the years to see greatly gifted persons enter ministry with enormous potential, but then don't recognise their own fragility and vulnerability.
喺過去咁多年裏邊，一樣嘢令到我最心痛嘅就係見到一啲原本係好有潛能嘅人入嚟侍奉嘅時候，佢哋原本係有好多嘅能力，但係佢哋唔明白自己嘅虧缺同埋自己嘅脆弱。
They become self-sufficient, and they don't survive long term because of issues of character and of integrity.
佢哋以為自己可以自給自足，但係長遠嚟講，佢哋就唔可以繼續啦。呢一個就係性格嘅問題。
And then Paul speaks in this passage about there being no delusion about the challenges of serving.
第三點就係保羅對於服侍而帶嚟嘅挑戰，不抱有幻想。
In verse 1 he writes, Therefore, since through God's mercy we have this ministry, we do not lose heart.
喺第一節佢話：我們既然蒙憐憫，受了這職分，就不喪膽。
You know, the problem of losing heart and becoming discouraged in Christian service, unfortunately, is a common one.
喺基督徒嘅侍奉嘅事上邊，喪膽或者係覺得灰心係一個好常見嘅事。
Paul uses the same word in Galatians 6 and verse 9 when he says, "Let us not become weary in doing good."
喺加拉太書6章9節，保羅亦都係咁樣話：我們行善不可喪志。
I mean, here is a wise man,
保羅係一個好聰明嘅人，
a man who himself is scarred but not bitter.
佢受過好多嘅傷害，不過佢冇完全灰心。
A servant who, despite being treated unfairly on numerous occasions, remains committed to continuing to serve.
作為一個僕人，雖然喺當中佢哋受到好多不平等嘅對待，但係佢決志繼續去做佢嘅工作。
I mean, every one of us who seeks to serve the Lord knows about losing heart from time to time, and often we feel like giving up and throwing in the towel.
在座當中有為神服侍過嘅，都明白久唔久我哋就會喪膽，亦都好想完全放棄扯白旗。
That's true whether we are pastors or cross-cultural workers or evangelists or serving in all kinds of roles within the church, or those living for Christ in their home and in their workplace.
不論你係牧師、跨文化工作者、宣道家，或者喺教會有着唔同事務嘅，或者簡單咁喺你嘅屋企或者你嘅職場裏邊，想活出一個基督徒嘅樣式。
Not everything is wonderful.
唔係所有嘢都係咁圓滿嘅。
Not everyone we serve is motivated or responsive to our ministry.
我哋侍奉嘅時候，唔係所有人我哋接觸嘅都覺得興奮或者係有反應。
At times it can be a boring challenge.
有陣時係一啲好沉悶嘅挑戰。
At times service can become quite routine.
有陣時呢啲侍奉就變咗好一個好死板嘅工作。
And we might be the brightest and the best educated person here, and yet we find ourselves challenged and perplexed at the variety of situations in which we find ourselves.
或者我哋會係一個好醒目或者係好有教養嘅人，但係喺唔同嘅環境裏邊，我哋就會發覺我哋係被挑戰同埋被困惑。
We are aware of being a minority in our society and aware of the rejection of the message of our gospel.
我哋絕對知道作為基督徒喺呢個社會裏邊係一個小分子，亦都明白福音好多時係喺普遍嚟講，大多人都係抗拒。
You know, there are those who live and work with, those that we live and work with do not always welcome the gospel or see the need for it.
我哋一齊工作或者一齊生活嘅人，佢哋未必歡迎福音，亦都睇唔到佢哋對福音有咩需要。
And that veil won't be removed until they confess their ignorance and helplessness.
而呢個幔子係唔會打開，直至到佢哋自己承認自己嘅無知或者係無助嘅時候。
At times we become disappointed by the lack of response to the world to the gospel, but also can be discouraged by the mood and the attitude of fellow Christians.
好多時我哋見到呢個世界對福音冇乜反應嘅時候，我哋就會好失望。但係有時就算係附近嘅基督徒，你睇到佢哋嘅情緒或者係態度嘅時候，你一樣會感覺到灰心。
Here at Corinth, there were quarrelsome, critical church members.
而家喺呢個哥林多教會裏邊，有啲好執拗、好極端嘅教會分子。
Some men that Paul counted on didn't back him up, and Demas deserted him and returned to the ways of the world.
有啲人原本係好支持保羅嘅，而家都唔支持佢啦。又好似底馬咁， 佢愛世界多於愛福音，而家又離開咗保羅。
Sometimes there are people whom we have great hopes for, who prove in the end to be deep disappointments.
所以有其時我哋見到一啲人，我哋原本對佢好大期望嘅，終歸就俾到我哋有好多好多嘅傷痛。
And there are times when we feel inadequate and feel like failures, and the mistakes of the past come back to haunt us.
亦都喺一個時刻裏邊，我哋會覺得自己係好欠缺同埋就嚟失敗嘅時候，最不幸嘅就係過往失敗嘅經驗，又喺呢個時刻走到你嘅身上，令到你苦上加苦。
And you know, the more sensitive and conscientious and spiritually minded we are, often the more we feel the weakness, we feel the criticism and the loneliness and the isolation that wholehearted service can bring.
如果你係全心全意去做呢啲侍奉，再加上你有一個好敏感、有一個責任感同埋靈命上好專注嘅心去分析嘅時候，你就會感覺到當中嘅軟弱、批評、孤單同埋被孤立嘅感覺。
However, according to Paul, the answer to this is to look to Jesus and to consider his dealings with us and all that we owe him and his purposes.
但係從保羅呢度嘅書信嚟講，對於呢啲反應嘅答案就係仰望耶穌，想下佢為我哋做咗乜嘢，我哋仍然欠佢有啲乜嘢，同埋佢嘅大期望係乜嘢。
We have all received mercy.
我哋每一個都接受咗好多嘅憐憫同埋恩典。
I mean, Paul was once a blasphemer, a persecutor, a violent man, but God had patience with him and saved him and put him into his service.
保羅曾經係一個唔信嘅人，佢褻瀆神靈，亦都係逼迫同埋一個好兇狠嘅人。但係上帝對佢好有耐心，拯救咗佢，擺佢喺佢嘅工作當中。
And God can do the same with us.
同樣，神亦都可以對我哋做同一件事。
Paul had a sense that God's hand was upon him and his life was the outworking of divine purposes.
保羅感覺到神嘅手喺佢嘅身上，而佢嘅生命就係神要佢展現佢最終榮耀嘅目的。
God didn't hold him with an iron fist, but with a loving grip.
神唔係用一個鐵腕嘅手段控制住保羅，而係用一個愛嘅手。
He found his encouragement not in his circumstances or service, but in the Lord himself.
就係藉着神，保羅得到呢一個鼓勵，絕對唔係當其時嘅環境或者係佢做過啲乜嘢。
Later on in chapter 11, where we find Paul defending himself, he testifies that as a result of his ministry, he himself had experienced this darker side.
喺臨後11章嘅時候，你就會發覺保羅就解釋喺佢成個事工裏邊，佢自己親身經歷過好多黑暗嘅一面。
You see, Paul's not writing just from theory.
大家要明白，保羅寫呢啲書信唔係純粹係藉着理論。
He knows the reality of experience.
佢有事實，有經驗。
He knew what it was like to be pressured and to be confused and to be persecuted and to be struck down.
佢絕對明白點樣佢被受逼迫、受困擾、受迫害同埋被逼倒。
You see, service isn't always about sweetness and delight.
侍奉唔係時時都係咁甜蜜同埋開心。
And there are times when we're serving God that we want to say, where's God now? You know, right now.
絕對相信，當你喺個侍奉當中嘅時候，好多時你都會問神喺邊度？你而家喺邊度？
And sometimes when the hardness and the blackness and the sorrow and the disappointments of people can come over you like a flood.
好多時由周遭嘅人帶嚟咗好多嘅困難、黑暗、悲傷同埋失落，就好似洪水咁淹沒咗你。
However, despite the impact of these struggles had made on Paul's life, he was able to testify again in verse 16 that we do not lose heart.
雖然有咁多唔好嘅遭遇，但係喺保羅喺第16節嗰度，佢再講嘅就係我們不喪膽。
You see, such experiences do not need to lead to bitterness or resentment, even though it does take its toll.
呢啲咁嘅唔好嘅經驗係唔應該帶至一個苦澀或者一個怨恨，雖然佢哋對我哋影響係好大。
In fact, Paul is able to reaffirm his commitment to faith and service with courage and determination in the face of even these difficulties.
反之喺面對咁多困難嘅時候，保羅可以重新確認佢嘅對信仰同埋侍奉嘅承諾，更加充滿勇氣同埋決心。
And even though he's experiencing these struggles, he can also testify that he isn't crushed, he doesn't despair, he isn't abandoned or destroyed.
雖然佢經歷咗咁多嘅苦難，但係佢最終可以宣言嘅就係佢未被打低，佢冇失望，佢冇放棄，亦都冇被擊倒。
And then fourthly, Paul expresses that he has confidence in the power of God.
第四點嘅就係保羅對神嘅能力堅信不疑。
He wasn't there to draw attention to himself.
保羅做事唔係為咗想人留意佢。
He wasn't serving to make a name for Paul.
佢做事唔係為咗自己嘅名聲。
He was there to model servanthood for Jesus' sake.
佢做事係為咗耶穌作為一個僕人。
And as he says in verse 6, for light to shine in darkness.
佢喺第6節咁樣話，光從黑暗裏照出來。
It can be so easy to draw attention to oneself.
其實好易嘅咋，你要人人注視你。
But the message we preach must be that Jesus Christ is Lord.
但係我哋要傳揚嘅信息就係應該係耶穌或者係我哋嘅上帝。
As he says in verse 15, so that people turn to God with increasing thanksgiving and glorifying God.
喺第15節，保羅咁講，好叫因為因人多越發加增，感謝格外顯多，以致榮耀歸於神。
And we press on because the way we see lives and communities transformed.
我哋齊心邁進、竭力同行嘅原因，就係因為我哋見到生命同埋群體有更生。
And then finally, Paul affirms what motivates his life and service.
最後一點，保羅就確認激勵佢生命同埋服侍嘅因素。
Paul comes back to why he doesn't lose heart or get discouraged in serving.
保羅再重申點解佢喺侍奉當中唔會喪膽或者泄氣。
Despite there being those who will criticize him and accuse him of being crazy, in Paul's life it is the love of Christ that drives him and impassions him.
雖然佢係被人批評，甚至係控告佢係瘋癲，但係喺保羅嘅生命裏邊，刺激佢嘅就係神嘅愛。
As I said, this is no theory for Paul.
喺保羅嘅理論裏邊，從來都冇說不。
See, Jesus had so transformed him that he couldn't help himself.
耶穌將佢更新到一個地步，佢都冇辦法停止。
Such is the change that God had done in his life. His world had been turned upside down, that he'd become a new creature.
神喺佢嘅生命裏邊所做嘅嘢，將佢個世界全個反轉，佢變咗一個新造嘅人。
And you know, God can do the same in every one of our lives.
大家都知道，神亦都可以對我哋嘅生命做同樣嘅事。
We are all earthen vessels, flawed, broken, chipped.
我哋都係一個瓦器，有缺陷、有崩嘅，或者甚至係爛嘅。
And at times we may feel anxious and inadequate. We'll find ourselves being disappointed or let down.
好多時我哋都會覺得自己有不足，好有焦慮，好失望，同埋想放棄。
But friends, they are the times when God can actually really work through us as we serve Him.
但係呢個時刻就係神喺我哋身上可以動工嘅時候。
Do not lose heart,
不要喪膽，
but to the glory be to Him.
榮耀歸於基督。
Amen.
阿門。
各位弟兄妹可以起立。好感謝簡牧師嘅分享。今朝其實呢，點解會遲咗開始個崇拜呢？就係因為我唔見咗支咪，跟住其實有好多我哋無論喺教會喺生活上嘅服侍，都好似頭先嘅信息一樣，我哋都有虧欠，都有好多嘅軟弱。其實我哋係預計唔到，因為我哋本是人，上帝先係完美嘅。所以都好回應到我哋能夠榮耀嘅只有上帝，讓我哋一齊唱快上路去回應啱啱嘅信息。
快上路，天國呼聲前近，投身於建立教會去服侍人，空空的心，碎掉了一切那麼灰暗，背起責任，全奉上，將活祭為獻給神。我決定一切靠主導引，憑主恩發掘那真我作僕人，完全身心放下了私心己意，天天與主靠近，懷着愛心熱抗傳宗教恩，完全的委身，完全將主分，我願意各路學子滿血能，靈魂要震撼，全人經火浸，我願去各地各方留下腳印。快上路，天國呼聲漸近，投身於建立教會去服侍人，空空的心，掃掉了一切那麼灰暗，背起責任，全奉上，作活祭為獻給神。我決定一世靠主導引，憑主恩，我更更真我作僕人，完全身心放下了私心己意，天天與主靠近，懷着愛心熱抗傳宗教恩，完全的委身，完全將主分，我願意各路學子滿血能，靈魂要震撼，全人經火浸，我願去各地各方留下腳印。
我哋一齊去領受從神而嚟嘅祝福。願主耶穌基督嘅恩惠、天父嘅慈愛同埋聖靈嘅感動，都時時刻刻同我哋每一個人同在， 直到永永遠遠。阿門。各位請坐。好開心啊！我哋大家可以參加我哋今日嘅粵語早堂崇拜。想問下呢，有冇第一次參加我哋粵語9點鐘崇拜嘅新朋友啊？如果有嘅時候，可唔可以請你舉手向我示意下呢？好，咁我哋呢就有一啲嘅報告。咁首先呢，就係啦，我哋繼續係奉獻啊！我哋需要衷心去奉獻喎，無論係網上嘅定係實體嘅奉獻。咁另外呢，就係呢個呢係代表下午堂崇拜呢有少少嘅報告嘅，就係呢佢哋嗰個嘅查經嘅課程啊，咁佢哋嗰個福音查經同埋佢哋嗰個中年嘅查經呢。咁就係時間上邊呢，就係喺星期日即係嗰個福音性嘅查經呢，就喺星期日嘅下晝3點半至到4點15分喺我哋嘅會客室嘅。咁另外呢，就係嗰個中年嘅查經呢，咁就係譚傳道去帶領嘅，咁就會係轉咗去星期六嘅下晝2點半至4點鐘嘅Zoom， 即係喺網上嗰度呢嚟到去進行嚇。咁所以福音性查經呢，就係星期日下晝3點半至到4點15分，就係Danny 執事咧去帶領，而中年嘅查經咧就轉咗星期六嘅下晝3點半至到4點，就喺網上咧去進行嘅。咁樣咧就另外咧就係下個星期啦，我哋嘅中浸論壇。咁我哋之前咧簡牧師亦都係直情喺視像嘅裏邊咧嚟到係去呼籲希望我哋教會嘅一份子咧，我哋能夠喺呢個論壇嘅裏邊嚟到係去特別咧強調係用我哋自己嘅語言我哋咧係可以唔會係受語言嘅限制嘅，係用翻你嘅語言咧，我哋希望咧嚟到一齊嚟到去禱告，一齊去分享你對我哋嗰個教會嗰個嘅發展所以咧唔可以少咗你嘅希望咧大家咧喺下個星期4月10號嘅下晝1點半鐘咧，就喺我哋翻呢個嘅地方喺教會喺翻呢度咧，我哋會係有一個聚會同埋分享只設實體喎。就係因為咧，我哋好重視咧，即係我哋大家真係去在場，大家一齊去同在，一齊去分享嘅。希望大家踴躍參加。咁仲有咧，就係下個星期咧，我哋好感恩啊，因為復活節咧就已經係好近咯。咁下個星期咧就係即係都係一個即係耶穌復活之前嘅一個星期。咁所以咧，我哋除咗係我哋嘅聖餐嘅主日之外咧，咁亦都係有我哋嘅受難復活組曲我哋好感激、好感謝詩班呢嚟到係俾我哋呢有好美妙嘅詩歌呢個嘅即係關於耶穌嘅受難復活嘅組曲，亦都係適逢住嗰個嘅聖餐主日呢，亦都係我哋有一個棕樹 之嘅主日嘅一個嘅崇拜，咁希望大家咧預備身心靈。咁仲有咧就係因為咧亦都係我哋嘅學校嘅假期嘅開始啊，咁所以咧我哋其實以後咧我哋嗰個學校假期咧，我哋係好感恩，就會係有埋我哋一班嘅兒主嘅同學嘅小朋友咧嚟到係可以同我哋一齊去參與崇拜啊！呢個唔係淨係今次喎，係以後我哋咧有一個嘅即係我哋學校嘅假期嘅時候呢，咁我哋就會係有我哋嘅小朋友、我哋嘅子女嚟到係可以喺我哋嘅崇拜嘅裏邊呢一齊去參與。呢個呢係實在係一件非常之美麗嘅事因為呢個係聖經啟示錄，特別係各方各國各族嘅人唔同種族、唔同嘅背景嘅人呢都可以聚集小朋友嘅、大嘅、有老有嫩，全部人都一齊。咁咧，我哋係好希望咧，大家都係除咗係為我哋下個星期嗰個主日咧，亦都係俾大家知道我哋嗰個復活節嗰個嘅聚會嘅安排。咁我哋咧喺4月14號嘅時候係星期四嚟嘅。其實我哋之前咧已經有舉辦過，就係下晝7點半有我哋嘅熄燈禮嘅崇拜。咁呢個呢，就係即係耶穌佢受難之前受審訊最黑暗嘅時間，係嗰個嘅紀念嗰個嘅時段。而到4月15號係星期五，就係有我哋9點半呢有我哋嘅受難節嘅崇拜。而仲有就係4月17號就係我哋嘅復活主日嘅崇拜。咁樣我哋為着我哋呢啲嘅因應復活節紀念耶穌基督佢嘅即係佢降生嘅時候，佢為我哋所做嘅一切我哋咧都去好好預備我哋嘅身心靈。咁仲有咧就係一個晨光關懷協會咧，佢其實都係有好多唔同嘅聚會嘅咁咧我都邀請大家咧可以上去佢嗰個嘅網頁嘅上邊咧嚟到係去睇我哋好多唔同嘅聚會同埋咧你可以喺網上咧嚟到去報名咁樣咧，仲有就係最後啦，我哋即係邀請你咧，如果你有啲咩嘅需要嘅話咧，譚傳道同埋我咧，我哋都係隨時咧嚟到願意支持你，去為你祈禱嘅。無論係你去將你嘅代禱嘅需要去話俾我哋知，我哋喺逢星期四咧我同阿譚傳咧，我哋係會即係為好多唔同嘅事工同埋我哋大家嘅唔同嘅需要咧去禱告呢個淨係我哋同佢之間咧去禱告，又或者你希望咧係喺嗰個牧禱嘅上邊咧都可以係得到大家對你嘅支持同埋祈禱嘅話咧，亦都係無任歡迎。咁邀請大家咧如果你有啲咩需要，有啲咩嘅事情咧，你就同我哋嚟到去分享，同我哋講，我哋去為你祈禱。咁我哋仲有我哋每個星期嘅網上嘅祈禱會啦。咁逢星期二同埋星期四喺8點同埋9點鐘嘅時間希望咧即係總有一個時間咧會啱你嘅，我哋可以一齊喺網上去祈禱。咁我哋個報告咧到呢一度啦。咁我哋默禱之後咧，下個星期再見大家。